The Kansas City Shuffle is a sleight of hand or a con artist trick where effectively I make you look left when I go right. Now, boxers know this. They feint with the right and they hit with the left. Chess players know this. They move with the rook to get your attention, but they're striking with the knight. Now, I have been wondering lately if we have been watching the Kansas City Shuffle of geopolitics roll out right in front of our eyes and nobody is paying attention. To help me understand how correct I am or incorrect, I've invited Pascal Lottaz, who's a professor of neutrality studies in Kyoto and in Tokyo. He's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the geopolitical dynamics that really control our world, not the headlines, but the real politic that matters. This is the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Here's Pascal.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Pascal. Pascal, it's great to have you back on the program. I'm looking forward to chatting with you today. How you doing?
Thanks for having me back, Jay. Fantastic. The weather is sunny over here in Japan.
All right, here in Indonesia as well. I love it, man. So, Kate, a few different directions I want to go with you today. I'm working on this thesis that I maybe want to lay out for you and just get your thoughts on. So if I were playing a game of chess, right, and I had you distracted with my rook and my knight over in this corner of the board, what I'd want to be doing simultaneously is paying attention to maybe my bishop and my other knight, and the move that I'm really trying to employ. Well, I've got you distracted over here, right? It's the feint strategy, similar for, a kickboxer. I'm going to roll my right shoulder, but I'm actually setting up my left hand, And right now, everybody is very focused on a few things from a geopolitical standpoint, right? We're looking at Russia, Ukraine, obviously we're looking at the Middle East, et cetera. A few people are looking at the South China Sea, but here's what I'm wondering about. So there seems to be three simmering flashpoints in the globe right now, and I want to run these past you and get your thoughts. The first is the South China Sea, and although a lot of people look at this and they say it's a U.S.-China conflict, it's obviously not. It's a Malaysian, it's a Vietnamese, it's a Philippine, it's a Brunei conflict, and there's amazing activity occurring right now where China is piling sand onto a bunch of reefs and atolls and building military bases where there wasn't land before. And this battle is happening right now in terms of territory and dispute. And it seems like the most tension right now that hasn't erupted yet is there. There's also a budding conflict, I believe, in the Arctic. And not many people are talking about this at all. But as a consequence of sea ice melting, a new trade route has opened up, the North Sea route, right? Which is important because this gives China access to Europe without going through the Suez Canal and cutting travel down by about 15 days. It gives Russia direct access to the U.S. mainland. That's a bit of a military threat. But the point is, while everyone's focused on Russia, Ukraine, Russia's been expanding their military bases in the Arctic at a rapid rate. And they've, I think, resurrected about 50 Soviet-era bases on the Arctic coast. And no NATO countries even come close to matching that distribution of infrastructure and power. And so this seems to me like a new emergent region that didn't used to be important because it was frozen. It's not anymore. And Russia's moved in aggressively. China's now self-labeled as a near Arctic nation. So they're claiming territory and influence in the region as well. The third would be the Caribbean. And the Caribbean's not getting any attention at all. But if you look at Chinese investment in Barbados and Trinidad, in Jamaica, in Cuba, they've been very aggressive at deploying billions and billions of dollars, not military infrastructure, but infrastructure nonetheless, and a lot of unique debt agreements that create a lot of leverage over these countries should they ever choose to employ that. And so they're setting up the chess pieces in far more places than people seem to be paying attention to. And I'm just like, how coordinated is this, right? As we sort of try to migrate through this new geopolitical reality and reshuffling of the chessboard, how do you view what I just shared with you, Pascal? What's relevant and front and center to you? What am I maybe sensationalizing and making more out of than actually exists? What's your take?
I think you're doing a very smart thing. It is absolutely right to try to look at the places that do not get the headlines on the news. And all three that you mentioned are important. I think the biggest one, the biggest potential flashpoint is the South China Sea, East China Sea, the especially Taiwan for the obvious reasons that we all know about, but we discussed this already last time. Those are flashpoints for direct hard military conflicts, the way that we have a hard military conflict in Ukraine, right? Ukraine was not on the radar of a lot of people before February 2022. It was on the radar of a lot of people in the security community who were aware of the fighting that already had been going on between 2014 and 2022, who were aware that there is at the time we called it a frozen conflict, although 14,000 people died in Ukraine. In the Donbass between 2014 and 2022, but because the conflict was kind of in a deadlocked in the sense that nothing was moving, and both sides still kept shelling and so on, we called it a frozen conflict. But it really was the prelude to what then happened after more or less exactly 3 years ago. But it wasn't on the forefront of everybody's minds until around 2021, when things started spiraling toward what we've got now. Now, what you're doing is you're pointing out the other potential flashpoints. I think the least of the three is probably the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is so clearly militarily outside of the realm of what is thinkable for a hard geostrategic clash between two powers. It's absolutely correct that yes, China is investing over there and is building infrastructure. On the other hand, China does that all over the world, actually. And one of the largest investments that China has going is actually in the United States. The US buys massive amounts of US treasury bonds, or used to. And the one of the reasons for that is that China has loose cash. It's like, where do I invest? Where do I put my money? So it's not all just about geostrategic interests. It's also just about how do I deploy my resources? And I think investors see that, because the Chinese, on the one hand, it's a communist party running the country, but a Chinese analyst once made the very important observation that China is not a capitalist country, but it is a market economy. It runs on the principles of market economies, not the country inside and outside. So they play along. I mean, they play in the market economy game, just like you and I and everybody else. Internally, like in terms of political power structure, they're different. But externally, the way they engage, also in trade and so on, you would expect. You have to think of China facing the same investment challenges and thinking the way the United States does. There's just large capital available. So what do you do with it? So the Caribbean is one point where some of this investment goes, and China has a clear strategy of developing infrastructure, not out of just the goodwill of the heart, but because it also wants to use these trade routes. I mean, the One Belt, One Road initiative, which now kind of got superseded a little bit by the BRICS discussion about BRICS, but the One Belt, One Road initiative is still there. It's still the vision, at least what I hear from my friends from China and also Southeast Asia, that this is still very much at the heart, building these trade links. The third one you talked about, the Arctic, is very important because of the melting ice and because of the trade routes. And with trade routes comes the potential for opportunities and for conflict. And one of the misconceptions that we had for the longest time is that Russia and the United States are at opposite ends of the globe because they kind of conveniently sit there on our maps. But in fact, they're direct neighbors. The Bering Strait, they're direct neighbors, and neighbors to Canada as well, right? And they're direct neighbors, not just on the eastern part or the western part of Canada and Alaska. They're also direct neighbors in the Arctic. It's, if some of these ballistic missiles, if they flew, they wouldn't fly over Europe. They would fly over the Arctic, right? That would be the trajectory. We keep forgetting about that because we have the world, a view of the world of this two-dimensional map, but the thing's a three-dimensional globe, right? And right now, this part in between that blocked ships, not missiles, but ships, is changing. And I do think this will be one of the flashpoints of the next 50 years. I interpret Donald Trump's move or rhetoric, trying to somehow grab Greenland as part of the US trying to move closer to the Arctic, because this is now a geostrategically important plot of land. I'm not sure anymore. I think Russia has the longest Arctic border, but number 2 is immediately Canada. So Canada is also highly involved in this, and this is also one of the backdrops to Donald Trump's remarks about Canada should join the United States, because this is a place for a potential problem for the US. For the longest time, the view was that the US is so secure because it only has fish to the east and fish to the west, Mexico to the south, and Canada to the north. But turns out that to the north, you're getting very much closer to Russia now, to the north. And that's something to keep in mind. So yes, I think you're absolutely right looking at that.
A couple things that are interesting there. It should, and I've been wondering this as well, because yes, Canada has the second largest Arctic coastline and Greenland has the third. So coincidence that Russia's been expanding their military outposts along their Arctic coast, and Donald Trump is suddenly so interested in annexing Canada and Greenland. And I have to think we talk about, it's about drugs at the border. It's about mineral rights. And maybe it is. Maybe it's about applying pressure or looking for access to that northern coastline that we have not been developing at all, and not even just relative to Russia. We haven't been developing it at all, but Russia is. And I've wondered how much that activity is making the United States military establishment insecure and saying, we need to find a way to access that coastline because our allies aren't. They're sitting on it, but they're not doing anything, right? And our adversaries become very active up there. Do you think that's a tie-in, or what's your take?
I'm not sure about it. I mean, this is one of the things that was or is being discussed in these security circles, but I haven't seen it as a burning flashpoint in the big news media. So I wonder what it is that pushes Donald Trump toward this. I think he has access now to much better information than he had before. At least since the appointment of Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence, but even before, because the first Trump administration, he kind of boxed himself in by the people that he chose to run his show. And right before we started recording, we talked about the importance of how you set up a team, right? And his first team, when it comes to foreign policy, was a catastrophe with John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. It's the people who would tell him stories like fantasy world about how the international world worked. Now he has a team of people that I think are much more realistic in their outlook of great power politics. J.D. Vance as his vice president. He has Rubio as Secretary of State. He has Tulsi Gabbard, who is now responsible for briefing him. And he doesn't only have her to run things, we know that he trusts her, and we know what her outlook on geostrategy is. So I do believe that he has a better view. So there is a chance that this is one of the things that was discussed within his closest circle, that this buildup of Russian buildup of their Arctic coastline, that this is something that Donald Trump feels needs to be responded to. But this is pure trajectory. I have no idea. This might be coincidence and just him being like, okay. Then again, I don't think it is coincidence, because the places that he picked out as his strategic talking points are very, very geostrategically important. The other one is the Panama Canal. It's okay on the one hand, we built it and we did it back and we did a bad deal. It's like, this is like pivotal for any kind of military activity, right? You need that goddamn canal in order to move your ships left and right. Like, it's very simple, actually, chessboard kind of thinking of stuff. But I would guess you're right. these issues are connected. And on the one hand, he now wants better relationship with Russia. On the other hand, clearly the outlook is not one of let's create eternal peace on earth. It's more like let's reposition ourselves. And there's a very important argument out by Brian Baletic saying that, look, historically speaking, the US has always been using times of détente in order to regroup and get ready for the next kind of push for domination. So I don't know which one it is. We know that the rhetoric of Donald Trump is one of de-escalation, but whether he believes in that himself is one question, and whether this might continue over several administration is another.
You know, and one last thing that I just wanted to point out that you mentioned earlier is how our perception of the geographic distance between Russia and the United States is a complete fallacy. And yes, if you look at most any map, it appears to be the case. It's because we look at maps that are flat. But, you know, and it just struck me because right now I'm reading the history of Alexander Baranov, who really led the Russian America Company back at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And this is how Russia ended up controlling Alaska before they sold it to the United States. What people don't realize is how close he was, Alexander Baranov, to also controlling California and Hawaii. And he was making attempts, striking deals with the chiefs and kings in Hawaii, but didn't get one done. You know, had an outpost in California, wasn't able to hold on to it, all this stuff. But, you know, the Russian America Company is a fascinating part of history. And you know, it wasn't a long trip to get there, right? It's, and he died in Java, actually. Baranov died in Java, Indonesia, where I am today. So anyways, fascinating story. Here's where I want to go. Any comments on that? And then I want to move on to something else here.
It's fascinating. You know, we underestimate the scramble for the Americas and how the United States really ended up winning, because the United States started as like a little colony, like 13 colonies, right? They kind of banded together, but the whole hinterland was free, was open, and it was these 13 colonies that managed to get it. And not only that, they also managed to get Hawaii. And if you look, Hawaii understood the precarious situation it was in very, very precisely. They since the 1860s, they wanted to be perceived as a neutral country. They said we are neutral, and we strike neutrality, we strike agreements, and we make international agreements with everybody to recognize us. They had a diplomat in Tokyo. They had diplomats all over Europe. Hawaii shows up. The Kingdom of Hawaii shows up as a trade partner of Switzerland ever since the 1870s, up until 1899, when in one of these little trade statistics there's an asterisk saying from today on trade with Hawaii will be subsumed under the United States, which annexed it. Period. End of sovereignty for you, Hawaii. But Hawaii was recognized as a nation state very clearly, and that success of the United States, you know, going around and acquiring these lands is I think up until today quite underestimated.
So you mentioned a thesis, and I didn't catch the author's name. You said his first name is Brian, but his thesis effectively is United States uses these periods of détente in order to regroup for the next stage of expansion, or something close to that was what you shared. Could you expand on that? And first of all, I'd love to gather his name from you and then have you expand on that thesis.
So his name is Brian Baletic. He runs a YouTube channel called The New Atlas. And he's a very brilliant analyst. He actually lives he's in Thailand, so he's also not too far away. He, you know, right now a lot of us are pointing out how the United States is basically backstabbing its European allies, and how how the United States seems to be moving into a completely different direction. I mean, there's no doubt that the approach to foreign relations of Donald Trump, of the Trump administration, is completely different from the previous administration, right? But and that's what Brian Baletic says, is like, look, put it into the perspective of all of the last administrations. Whenever the United States needs time, you know, to regroup because a current approach isn't working, then they play for time. He uses the example, I think, of 2009 when Hillary Clinton and Lavrov literally pressed the reset button. Hillary Clinton gifted him like literally a little button in a box, and they pressed it together. It's like the big reset.
That's right.
It's really pretty. I mean, that video is only like a day or two old by Brian Beletic. You can watch it. He has it out there. And then his thesis is that currently this is going on, and actually it's kind of a work sharing thing that the Americans kind of try to feign interest in better relations with Russia, while the Europeans still keep on the pressure in Europe and hold the lines, if I understand him correctly. And that is something that could be going on. And that example can be extended into history, right? Even during the Cold War, the whole concept of détente is one built on the idea that we have a Cold War, and then we go through hot phases and we go through cooler phases, and we have relaxation of relations. The biggest one of those was in 1975, when after 3 years of negotiation, the US, Canada, and all of the European countries, including Russia, all the way to Mongolia, signed the final communique, or the final what was it called? The final act of the Helsinki Act, the final act of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE. That conference was huge. It was very important. It was very comprehensive, a strategic agreement of how to structure the security relationship, and also, human rights relationship of these countries. It was a huge success. Tremendous. And that was a high point of détente, but we went right back. And we went right back to people like Ronald Reagan, who on the one hand negotiated directly with Gorbachev. On the other hand, he also had this strategy of maximum pressure, saying like, we're going to build up our military arsenal, and we're just going to outspend the Soviets. So it's not... If what we're seeing right now, the question is what we are seeing right now a genuine change of hearts in the United States, a genuine change away from trying to achieve global hegemony or exercise global hegemony? Or is it just the latest iteration of what we have seen at least since 1945? Just another moment of détente, which is in preparation of the next big push toward still make that vision come true. Because some people, me included, are saying, oh, the United States is finally realizing that we're living in a multipolar world, is accepting the multipolar world as a given, and is now trying to embed itself in a strategic position in that new environment. The Europeans, that's still outside of their thinking. They cannot even fathom it. I mean, they are the most deluded bunch of them all at the moment. But the Americans are seeing it. And Baletic says wait, maybe not. Maybe it's just the strategy is still the same. It's just currently the policy that has been adjusted. And I don't know which one it is. Can't tell you.
Yeah, I mean, right away I was like, what's your take? If you were to guess, and maybe you kind of hinted at your belief that the U.S. is adopting and accepting the transition to a multipolar world as maybe not a positive or a negative, but just a reality, and therefore they should adapt accordingly. But Berletic, and I will check out the new Atlas on YouTube, thanks for that, has a different take, a more hawkish take on what the grander strategy might be.
A different interpretation of what's going on, or what the strategy actually is. One thing is that if that's correct, then the United States still struggles with the problem that the international world is moving into, is now a multipolar one, and that the distribution of forces and the distribution of power is radically different from even just 20 years ago. So that's, even if the long-term strategy of the US should remain the same, as in trying to maintain global hegemony as far as possible, the neocon dream of just having little military bases everywhere and basically, run the world the way the US currently runs the Europe, Western Europe, then that strategy would still probably fail on the sheer fact that not just with China, there's a new distribution of power, but also where you are right now, Southeast Asia is way more capable and way more confident of itself and developing at breakneck speed. So that's a new reality. And I mean, Indonesia, there's 180 million people, nearly 200 million people, on a vast archipelago. I mean, they have their problems and they have their worries, geopolitical worries, especially about a war between the US and China, and a war that then would suck in, almost necessarily, Australia. They are seriously worried about what to do if missiles keep flying over their archipelago, right? What do we do if the Chinese shoot at the Australians and the Australians at the Chinese? But overall, they are more capable actors that can do more than used to be the case, and that will necessarily influence the trajectory of whatever strategy it is the United States is going to pick from here on.
So to recap some of this thus far, I outlined the three sort of simmering tensions, call them Cold War, budding, whatever, South China Sea, and probably that has the most potential to boil up into something relative to the Arctic, where there's a lot of activity, a lot of infrastructure building, a lot of new trade potential, therefore economic potential for Russia and China. But not really, it doesn't appear at this case to be any sort of actual hot conflict brewing, more of a just trade territory, and the massive oil and gas reserves that are up there, of course. And the third that I mentioned, the Caribbean, I looked at the economic expansion and call it the strategic debt allocation of China through about 8 different countries down there. But as you pointed out, there's nothing really unique about that when you look at China's investment strategy. If you were to take it back to just general capital allocation, it's not such a exclamation point. So I appreciate that. Now, just because you mentioned the U.S. seemingly at odds now with Europe, and I think you said stabbing them in the back in terms of their foreign policy to a degree. I'd love to dig into that a little bit. So what's your take on the U.S. strategy to hold peace talks and exclude the Ukrainians and exclude the Europeans? You could read that, and I think, Trump's stance has been, you guys have been here for years and haven't got anything done, so I don't know what you can bring to the table, right? If you could have, you would have, but you didn't, so I'll take care of this now. I mean, that would be one interpretation of it. What's your take, Pascal? He's negotiating with Russia, then he's negotiating with Zelensky and trying to broker a deal as a mediator, but what's your take?
My take is that Donald Trump is correctly interpreting the stakeholders in this entire affair. Especially in mainstream media, for a long time, it was claimed that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, completely, excluding the entire role of NATO, all while shoveling all of these weapons in there, and all while saying we all stand with Ukraine. They were still at the same time pretending that they were not part of the conflict. Yes, you are. Obviously, you are. This is obviously about NATO, and the Russians have been most frustrated at this kind of refusal of just the accepting that this is about NATO and that this is first and foremost a conflict between Russia and the US. And, conflicts have various layers. And this one in Ukraine, very, very obviously, you have a civil war in Ukraine between the Donbass and the Kiev Central Authority. You have a hot war between Moscow and Kiev, right? Between Russia and Ukraine. And then you have a structural conflict between the Russia and NATO. And NATO is mainly dominated, not exclusively run, but dominated by the US. And the US strategy to approach Russia and balkanize Russia has been there for a long time. So obviously this is multi-layered, right? And in their speech acts, when Blinken and so on just always said, we will support Ukraine, everything is for Ukraine, we help Ukraine, we are not actors, we're just supporters. That was basically a strategy of denying the Russians any kind of point of contact with the US. So that's why there was the radio silence between the two. That was part of that, of the Biden strategy to fight out this proxy war. What Trump is doing is recognizing, no, this is between us. If Moscow and Washington come to an agreement, together we possess the necessary hard and soft power bring this to an end. So, and the strategy then is to go that route, to impose a resolution, or at least a process that leads toward a resolution from the top, and then force the others to go along. And in a way, this is outrageous to the Europeans and to Ukrainians first and foremost, because they were led to believe for the longest time that they are essential parts of this. We're all in this together, and we stand together and stick together, and we are all actors in our own rights. And now Donald Trump keeps telling them, no, you're not. we, Washington and Moscow, we're the actors. If you don't behave, you get the stick as well. If you do, we'll make sure that we give you some carrots. The big carrots are for us, for the big boys, and the small carrots we'll distribute them. If you don't want, you got the big stick, right? And that outrages them, and it outrages them because it's so honest, because it's so in your face. And now a lot of them are saying, the return of great power politics. Oh my God, we're being threatened. No, it always was great power politics. You just refused. You believed the sweet lie. You believed that you were an equal partner. Really, Kiev? Really, Brussels? You thought you're an equal partner just because Big Daddy in Washington tells you you're an equal partner? And now, you know what? You had to change in the CEO. The new CEO stops selling you that fantasy world, and that's what now creates this cognitive dissonance in them, saying like, "Oh, but we thought we were on the same page." At least that's how I interpret it. Now that's how I view it. And Brian Baletic made the important point to say, like, this is all just another layer of political theater, another what is it called, feint, and like pretending that this is what's going on. But at least to a lot of Europeans, this is very insulting, and I think they feel honestly insulted, and this is going to have an impact on their view on their alliance with the United States. And I know this has an impact in Japan. Japan already, and during the first Trump administration, was like questioning the loyalty to the US. I mean, the question is quite simple: if we remain loyal to the US, and if we keep giving the US what it wants, will it keep giving us back what we want? And that is. The distrust now is going to grow. Long answer to your question. I hope that makes sense. So that's how I interpret it, and it makes sense from a U.S. perspective. It makes sense that you sit together with a significant other and hammer out a deal, and the kids will follow suit because they have to. And it's also the fastest and most efficient way to negotiate. I mean, it's much easier to strike a bilateral agreement and have a strategy to string others along than to create a multilateral agreement among, like, what would it be, 35 states or so that would all want to say, and the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen want to sit at the table because they want to prove that they're big boys and girls as well. No. That's not efficient. So I think they're going for. I think that's part of the rationale behind this approach.
Let me ask you, Pascal, because, I mean, you study neutrality, right, as a profession. What should the purpose of NATO be, and what should the purpose of the United States be? Does NATO have a purpose, a relevant one? And if so, what would that be, right? How do you interpret these major power influences, and how they should, let's use the should word, how should they direct their energy and activities?
And optimally, NATO would be a defensive alliance that makes sure that Europe and North America can jointly secure themselves better than each country individually, right? And they would have a principle to say, like, we will never ever deploy any of our troops outside of our territory, which officially they have, but unofficially not unofficially. On the other hand, they also have this concept of out of area missions, right? They are now openly saying we're going to deploy our people elsewhere, and they really broke their own charter when they first started bombing Yugoslavia, which was not a NATO state, right? They started bombing places outside of the NATO area itself, which they shouldn't do. It's just like, it's outside of your charter. This is not self-defense anymore. You are starting to implementing like whatever kind of defense of whatever kind of people you think you should defend outside of your own border. So NATO is really outgrew what it originally was intended to be. Then again, I must also say that one of the most important definitions of what NATO is comes from its first General Secretary, Ismay Hastings, who said NATO is there to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. Three purposes, right? You want to make sure the US doesn't leave, because, the experience of the Europeans after the First World War was that the Americans came in, helped win the war against the Entente powers, and then they left again, and they reinstalled neutrality neutrality acts in the United States, and they went into what is often called isolationism, but it was not isolationism at all. It was really just military refocusing of yourself, because the US had a neutrality policy for 150 years, started by George Washington, who said we should care about ourselves and our own continent and affairs, and not on European affairs. And the US followed that for 150 years, while simultaneously using the Monroe Doctrine to basically be the top dog in the Americas, right? But that makes strategic sense in the way that you focus on where you're strongest at home. And that the First World War was kind of a break in that policy, but it was a short break. It was 1.5 years. The US only entered the First World War in 1917, right? And then it ended 1.5 years later. And then it went straight back. And the fear of the Europeans after the Second World War, and the US came in again and helped. I mean, the biggest part of the Second World War was won by the Red Army, was won by the Soviets, right? It was the Soviets who raided, in the end, went all the way to Berlin and really, took out Germany. That was done by them. But they were significantly helped by the United States, especially Britain. Britain was helped and defended mainly through the United States. And in the end, this cooperation is what brought the victory over Nazi Germany. And one of the fears was that the US would leave again. So, and repeat the First World War Act. So NATO was also designed in order to tie US security to European security and create a strategic kind of additional deterrent on the European continent. Although by that time, really, the Red Army was the most powerful actor on the European continent without question, because they had their people everywhere, and they had the operational capacity to continue. On the other hand, the US was the one who had then developed the nuclear bomb, which is why the Soviets had to develop the nuclear bomb very, very quickly, and they managed to do so in 1949, which was a huge shock to the Americans. And that the strategic calculus of the former ally now being the future enemy, that appeared immediately, not very quickly. I mean, up until 1944, 45, 46, there was a good group of people who seriously believed that the future would be one of US-Soviet cooperation. The famous Bretton Woods agreements, where the IMF and the World Bank and so on were created. The lead negotiators, they all believe they invited the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was there too, and the belief was that the Soviet Union would join all of those agreements and all of those institutions. Didn't happen, but in 1944 there was still, the thinking was, we're going to cooperate more than split apart. The big split, the Cold War, only became evident in 1946, 1947. And sorry, the point here was that. What was the point?
Well, I was questioning whether or not NATO still had a purpose, and if so,
the purpose, yes. So this triple purpose of making sure that the United States stays engaged with Europe, that Germany, the new Germany that emerged in 1949, the Federal Republic, West Germany, that it would be somehow integrated into the security structure, and lastly, to be a bulwark against Russia. That was, Hastings defined these three parameters. There were other options, the Soviets were very were, in my view, serious about their offer to make the Federal Republic a neutral, to let them become a reunified neutral state. And this offer was made around in 52, 53, and then Germany became a member of NATO in 54, right? But so there was a moment when it wasn't clear what would happen to this new Federal Republic, West Germany. And there was an option on the table, or 55, I think 55 was the year. I need to look it up, but the timeline here is very important. Long story short, didn't happen. The NATO evolved into being also an organization to create unity among these allies of the United States, and also reassure the Europeans that Germany would never be a mortal threat again, right? That rearming Germany because it's necessary to face the Soviets would not mean that suddenly you have a second Hitler coming, or like Germany for the third time trying to engage in this in affairs that would end up in a world war, right? Especially if you were French, you needed reassurance, especially French, but the Brits as well. So there are all of these reasons were there for NATO to be around, and NATO was used for all of those. And then with the end of the Cold War in 89-90, NATO really outlived all of those purposes, and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, right? The counter proposal that was made by the Soviets in 54 was dissolved. So there was really this crisis, and NATO, at one point, it became this slogan: either go out of area or go out of business. And NATO went out of area, and now my view of NATO is that it is a warmongering institution that tries to justify its own existence, and it's also a market for weapons for these countries, the Europeans, to buy from the Americans and so on. It creates a huge market, and it creates its own demand, and the NATO General Secretary is really more of a CEO of an organization that has something to sell, and it has to sell NATO to its members. And, whenever the General Secretary said, you need to increase your spending, each member country, what he means is you need to give us more money to buy more weapons and make us more structurally more important. It's quite a beast at this point. So I couldn't tell you what exactly right now its direct purpose is. All I know is it has its tentacles and feelers in many different places. And to me, it's a dangerous institution.
Mm. It's almost like a multipolar military industrial complex, right? Like a shared exposure. And, if you're in the shoes of the American establishment today, and you're looking at the contribution of each member, and you're unsatisfied with it because, you're the biggest supplier of arms to the organization, and really the only country that can create any relevant action if necessary. And then you enter a party like Doge, who's looking at the U.S. balance sheet and saying, we need to find a way to cut spending everywhere. And turns out, outside of interest expense, our largest one is military. Can we not share that among these member states a little bit more effectively? If you were to roll in with some massive saber rattling strategies and say, we're debating leaving NATO, we're debating withdrawing from Ukraine, Europe, you'll have to fight your own battle. We're withdrawing economically from Canada, or threatening to, or tariffs and all this stuff. I wonder how much of that is because when, this has been said a lot, but when Trump was elected the first time in 2016, I read his book, The Art of the Deal, which he wrote in the 80s, because I really had no idea who this guy was other than what I'd seen on TV. I was like, I don't know anything about him. So I read a few of his books, that one. And it struck me that his negotiating strategy hasn't really changed. Like in the book in the 80s, he's like, you want to walk into the boardroom, you want to say something crazy, throw everybody off balance, and then slide in your real demand. And your real demand is so moderate from where you started that you end up getting everything you asked for, right? And then he seems to employ that today. Like, he really likes to shake people up and throw people off balance, then slide in the real demand, right? We want 500 billion return from Ukraine in critical metals. And now it's probably like 100 billion is what he's going to be after, right? But that's kind of the strategy. We're going to withdraw from Ukraine. Well, probably not, but here's what we're actually going to do. We're going to annex Canada. Well, probably not, but here's what we might do, all these big statements. And if that saber rattling is enough to inspire countries, quite honestly, like Canada, I mean, I'm Canadian, and Canadians strike me as often very proud that we're not a military power. You know, I've heard this a lot over my life, right? And Canadians are very proud that we don't invest significantly in our military. We're a diplomatic region, which is great, except that that's because we have a massive border wall. It's called America, right? We're kept safe because of our neighbor. Our largest trading partner is the world's greatest military power, and the other side of our country is just ice, right? So we haven't had to, but that's been a luxury and made us a bit complacent. And maybe, you know, this is the United States way of shaking everybody up and saying, you've got to start doing your part, right? And maybe that's mainly what he's after. What do you think about that?
I think that's very likely. I mean, I never read The Art of the Deal, and I really have to do that now, because that's exactly what he's been doing over the last couple of months and in his first administration. This is his negotiation style. But the thing with military security and with paying for it is that it's not as easy as it seems. You know, if on the outside of it, you think that, oh, you just need to pay more, 5%, right, instead of 2 or whatnot. I mean, it's just okay. You double or times 2.5, right? Whatever you're expending. It's very simple, the way that you go and buy things at the supermarket. But that's not how it works, because first of all, 5% or any kind of percent of GDP spending is a stupid marker. It's so dumb. Just think about, there's 2 ways in which Canada could go from 2% to 5%. One is by increasing its expenditure on military equipment and military affairs. The other one is by halving its economy. If it halved its economy, it would have to, and kept that one stable, it would be the same. It's a stupid measure. You're right. Right. The other thing is that what do you do with that? I kept saying that for a long time, if Europeans spend more percentage of GDP on military affairs without actually looking what they're spending it for. I mean, you at some point you have a budget and then you'll just be asked to spend it, right? So, okay, increase our military and buy more weapons and buy F-35s and buy all of this equipment from who? Of course, from the United States. So basically it's a call for them to get more, to get more money into their military industrial complex. On the other hand, the United States is at what? At 3.5% or 4% or almost 5%. I forgot what they're spending on military affairs. But the point is they spend that on everything. I mean, all of their spending includes the spending in Japan for the Japanese bases in Yokosuka, somewhere over here. It includes all of the spending on US bases in the South China Sea. It includes Guam. It includes everything. It includes these 800 or so US military bases all over the globe. And not all of them are connected to NATO, right? Most of them aren't. I mean, this is what a lot of people don't realize. On the one hand, the US has a security arm through NATO. On the other hand, the US has a direct security arm through all of these bases. I mean, Sweden and Finland became part of NATO, and they agreed to have now each one 15, the other one 17 US military bases. These US military bases are not under NATO command. They are US command. And let's not forget, NATO command, if push comes to shove, the general in charge of the military affairs is going to be an American. But the bases themselves, this is direct US bilateral kind of hard power projection. And all of that is included in the US military spending. And that military spending is really not all just for NATO. So if Trump on the one hand asks, like, we have to spend more, first it's a stupid measure. Secondly, it means it's more money for the United States. And third, the US itself is not spending that much on NATO itself. And believe me, if NATO ever did something that the United States doesn't agree with or is opposed to, they would be the first ones to walk away. I mean, there's no question to that. You can see how the United States is often sabotaging the very institutions it creates itself. It was the US that created the World Trade Organization, and it's the US that's wrecking the World Trade Organization because it has outlived its immediate purpose. As soon as these organizations start tying the hands of the US walks away usually, unless they can't, like, let's say the United Nations. It's structurally too big and too important a forum. But even that one, I mean, at some point the US might walk away from it. But for now, that's not even under Trump. That hasn't been discussed. Yeah, that's my take. It's and for the Europeans, it's a stupid thing to do. If you start hunting after a nominal target about your security and do not consider what are your problems, then you're a dumbass. You're just a dumbass. It's just stupid. It's just, I mean, the question is, what is threatening me? And then based upon those threats or on the assessment, you formulate a strategy and then you try to get a budget for that, right? You don't start with a budget. If you start with a budget and then look for threats, then guess what? You're going to make up threats out of the blue. I mean, I have an alien to sell to you that you need to guard against. And I have a secret alien repellent weapon that I can sell you for a couple of $1 billion in order to hit your target. It's just that level of stupidity that kind of makes me angry.
I am super aligned with that. And, it's kind of one of the major failings of Canadian politics over the last 10 years, I'd say, but we start with the number, right? It's always start with the number. And recently, Canada's border has been making a lot of headlines. And right away, the establishments come back to say, we're going to supply $1.3 billion to fix this problem. And it's like, okay, but first of all, it's to find the problem. What are we going to do no entrepreneur would ever approach a problem that way, right? You wouldn't just exactly how much money can we create and throw at this problem to pacify the public, create a headline, but who knows if we're actually going to do anything. And that's so much of this is just create the headline, pacify the public, no action taken, right? Waste a bunch of taxpayer money. It is what it is. Okay. I want to pivot to the Middle East just to get your thoughts. I'm sure you're watching this develop, and maybe some of the major headlines would be Trump's claim to take over Gaza, repopulate, take that population and create new homes in Egypt and Jordan, and then some kind of real estate development in Gaza or something. I don't know what. Love to know your thoughts on that, because it's an interesting one. And maybe the other headline that I saw this week that made me cock an eyebrow was Israel making a quasi claim on most of southern Syria, which is a major increase in expansion ambitions than I've ever heard before from anyone. So what's your take on how that scenario is developing, those two headlines? Anything else that's front and center for you, Pascal?
Yeah, this is definitely the saddest of the things we have to talk about, because it has this very direct consequence on this. The tens of thousands of Palestinians who have died over the past 1.5 years. The sheer level of destruction. And one thing where I do not disagree with Donald Trump, one thing where I must say his assessment is correct, is when he says Gaza looks like a demolition site. It does. It was completely demolished. I mean, the living conditions of the people in Gaza are appalling. It's a huge crime what happened there. The issue, of course, is that the resistance in Gaza was fighting now for 1.5 years for their right to be in that land. So if Donald Trump proposes to move everybody, then this is, even if it is a bombastic claim, it goes on going back to the art of the deal, right? Even if that is the same thing here, he makes a bombastic claim, but then settles for something much, much smaller. If the approach is to bully the Palestinians and Hamas and so on into making a deal, then it would be it's a really stupid proposal because it is well understood. You can't. I mean, you just, for 1.5 years, Israel, and with the help of the United States, I mean, threw 2,000 pound bomb on them after another, and you didn't get rid of them. They stayed. I mean, they suffered hugely, and civilians died in scores on a daily basis, hundreds of people a week, right? It's absolutely appalling. But the one thing that it didn't achieve is to get rid of these people, right? So they will continue staying. So if the threat is, we're going to bring in a US military personnel, then the Hamas will say, like, okay, we'll fight on. This is existential, and existential to a level for Palestinians, for many Arabs, and for Hamas, first and foremost, to a level that, the word existential really means what it means there. Sometimes we use the word loosely, but here it means all or nothing, like as in survival of a group of people, or complete annihilation, and be that annihilation through direct genocide, killing of these people, or be it through expulsion and being dispersed all over the Middle East and sent into diaspora. Both of these scenarios seem to be equally unacceptable, of course, to the Palestinian resistance, and for Israel has obviously still more expansionary ambitions. They have been occupying the Golan Heights, which are officially part of Syria since 1967, and there was in breach of all UN resolutions and all UN law. But the one lesson that Israel learned is that if we do it, if we can do it, we can make it, right? And we don't need to care as long as the weapons and so on keep flowing, and the weapons keep flowing. There's no sign that the Trump administration breaks in any reasonable way with Israel, although that is really the only hope I have, that maybe that this idea of evicting all the Palestinians from Gaza was meant more as a negotiation strategy toward Israel than it was meant toward Hamas and the Palestinians, as in, again, like pretending to be on the Israeli side when in fact trying to figure out a way to actually do something for Gaza, say like, okay, we're gonna rebuild, we're going to evict everybody and rebuild everything, and Israel cheers, and then slowly changing the tune to like, okay, we're going to rebuild now, you stop bombing, and we evict them later, all the way to, we rebuild it, they're there, and let's make sure that we get something going. I mean, but maybe that's just me being an optimist, right? And I don't see any approach to that. It just seems that Donald Trump seems to be appalled by the pictures that he saw out of Gaza. So I would hope that he would try to do something about it, because like improving the living conditions of people in Gaza should be first and foremost on the agenda of every country on earth, because they're living in a horrible situation. Now, Israel, I don't know. Israel is to me at a very, very sad point of its national history, because on the one hand, you made it blatantly obvious to the rest of the world what kind of violence you're willing to bring up on people you perceive as your enemies, and that you're not willing to whose well-being you're not willing to keep in your mind. On the other hand, the expansions that is going on, and Israel already occupied parts of Syria, not just the Golan Heights. Also, since the Syrian government fell, they started immediately bombing military outposts and occupying parts of these borderlands, and they are now staying there. And funnily enough, our media in the West keeps pretending that this is normal. That Israel is now creating a buffer zone. This is a buffer for Israel, when in fact, what kind of buffer is that if your military is there, and if ever somebody attacks your military, you just claim that you need to increase the buffer? That's like, it's just make believe. I mean, Israel is expanding, is increasing its territory, is trying to realize some weird dreams, really not psychotic, but religiously fundamentalist beliefs and views of what Israel should be versus what it is. And it will lead to way more bloodshed. A lot of hundreds of people have died also in the West Bank. They were shot by the Israeli army point blank, and the West Bank will also it's already marked for demolition as well. So I'm very, very pessimistic about the prospects for this to get better, mainly because Israel is at the moment really, on a rampage. And it seems that it still gets enough support from the US and Europe, although some European countries are starting to have doubts and also officially said this must stop. But the support is still way too large. The only thing that made South Africa change its course when it was running its apartheid state was actually massive international pressure, right? And sanctions and massive like foreign pressure, and that pressure is nowhere near. We are nowhere near there. We are still at the point where things that I'm saying will lead people to claim that I'm an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
So we are still at that point, and especially in Europe, this is still even in Switzerland. Palestinian human rights activists get arrested. Ali Abu Nima, who was the leader of the electronic intifada, was arrested for 3 days in Switzerland and kept overnight in prison. And it's absolutely outrageous to me, absolutely outrageous that happened, and evicted under and the guy who was responsible for this, the politician, he said like, we deserves him right. We don't want anti-Semitic terrorist supporters in our country. And that this mindset is still rampant in Europe. That leaves me quite at a despair over the chances for a realistic resolution of the conflict, which to me would include massive pressure on Israel to change course. But then again, it's also the internal distribution of political power in Israel that make that unlikely, because the moderate forces in Israel are still extreme, and the sane voices in Israel are so few and far between. Like Ofer Kassif, an amazing Israeli Knesset member who is also rallying for the rights of the Palestinians and has a very humanistic and very, very, very sane outlook on the world. But he's one of a handful. So the people who have humanistic strategies to de-escalate this are far and few between, unfortunately.
Pascal, for anybody who's not familiar with what neutrality studies is, I want to maybe just wrap this up. I know you got to jump here, but how do you spend your time? How would you define neutrality studies? Obviously, I'm going to push people to your podcast. It's an excellent resource, but how do you define your work, Pascal?
Well, one part of my work is analysis, like what we are doing here. We talk to people and try to find out how they think, how Russian colleagues think, how Americans and Canadians and Indians and Indonesians think about how the international world works, and get different points of analysis. That's one part. The other thing is the academic. My academic work has to do with trying to understand the third-party politics in conflict. Neutrality not understood as international law of neutrality, although that's part of it, but not as like the things that Switzerland does because it says it is neutral, but what do third-party actors do? Those who are friends with two partners who are enemies to each other. Because that keeps happening time and again, right? In every war, you have two parties, and then you have other parties who don't want to join the war. But don't think only of war, think of conflict in general. When your kids fight with each other, how do you, as a dad who needs to have a good relationship with both of them, how do you act? How do you react to their conflict? What are the strategies deployed in order to de-escalate this? And I take it that far, this is not just a metaphor, but I think we can learn a lot from this conflict studies, also interpersonal conflict studies and conflict in organizations, in order to figure out how third parties can and do act in order to ameliorate conflict situations. Conflict situations are always unpleasant, and the most horrible of them are wars, of course, but they happen, they're natural. So as a conflict, I try to study this tool as a conflict management strategy, and hope that over the long run, I'll be able to figure out how it works well enough in order to make it deployable as a tool for great power, the management of great power relations, and a more peaceful world, if not one at complete peace, but at least less violent than it is now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And we don't know that. That's the thing. We don't have a structured way of approaching that topic. It just doesn't exist. So I want to make it exist and have more people study this, because I can't figure it out myself. It needs more people to think collectively and then start developing over the years.
I love that. Okay. Look, Pascal, I want to thank you for coming back on the show. It was great having you in Vancouver at my event last month. Super fun. I hope you can make it out next year. Thanks for coming back on. You know, in a couple of weeks, I have our mutual friend, Warwick Powell, who maybe you introduced me to. Yeah.
Possible. He's great. He's a great analyst.
He is. Yes. Maybe I found him on your channel. I think that's probably where I stumbled onto him. Anyways, I appreciate your time today. You're a wealth of knowledge and intelligence, doing admirable work. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Likewise, you're doing fantastic things and a very good job. I mean, Canada was great. So best of luck with your work too.
All right. Appreciate that, man.